continually counting ourselves as dead to sin is what part 2 of the Alive in Messiah course is all about. And it leads into the rest of Romans chapter 6 verse 11 that goes on to say, and alive to God in Messiah Yeshua. And we'll think about that in part 3. But for now, let's begin with this opening word, the word continually, through which Paul inspires us to never stop counting ourselves as dead to sin, as a lifestyle that touches everything we do, and implying that to not do so will have consequences. A bit like with weeds in a garden, that it's best to get on top of and then to stay on top. And it was with this in mind that Paul wrote to the believers in Rome, having heard that things were growing there that really did need weeding out sooner rather than later. Being seeded by the growing presence of Gentile believers who thought the Greek way rather than the Hebrew way, who didn't have the connection to Torah that the Jewish believers had, and who were beginning to question whether God had finished with Israel. Now, this was only a generation or so on from the first believers, still prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the dispersion of the Jewish people that followed, and long before the Roman Emperor Constantine officially severed the Jewish roots of the Christian faith at his so-called conversion around AD 315. But Paul had identified 3 major weeds that needed uprooting before they got more deeply established. Weed number 1 was the compartmentalized view of life that came from the Greek thinking of the Gentile believers, in which a division between the spiritual and the physical made an on-off approach to Christian living quite acceptable. Weed number 2 was the lack of appreciation of how much their Christian faith was rooted in the Torah. And weed number 3 was that if God was through with Israel, it implied that he did not do things continually. And if these weeds were allowed to grow, they'd choke the harvest of truth in future generations of believers. So Paul produced a comprehensive, multi-purpose spiritual weed killer, which we know as the Epistle to the Romans, that set out the great overview of God's continuing purposes to save mankind and of the continuing place of his chosen people, Israel, through statements like, God has not rejected his people whom he knew beforehand, and for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, as well as all Israel will be saved. And so through such statements, Paul was saying that despite all Israel's waywardness, God was still continuing on with his people, having called and gifted Israel to be a light to the nations, that will finally put the world on the spot as to whether it would turn to the God of Israel or reject him, as prophesied by Joel about how there will be multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of Adonai is near in the valley of decision. So Paul's aim was that the Jewish and Gentile believers in Rome would understand both the continuity of God's purposes and also the need to reflect it by continually counting themselves dead to sin and alive to God in Messiah Yeshua. Which is why in Romans chapters 9 to 11, Paul included the picture of the olive tree to describe how the Gentiles have been grafted into Israel, and therefore into God's continuing purposes through Israel. Also to show how they were rooted in Torah, and most notably in the Shema, the Hear, O Israel, which God had told Israel that for things to go well when they entered the promised land, they should love Adonai, your God, with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And this was not to be lived in an on-off way, but was to be lived out continually, saying, these words which I am commanding you today are to be on your heart. You are to teach them diligently to your children, and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand. They are to be as frontlets between your eyes, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And it was the same emphasis on continually that God gave his instruction to Joshua, saying, this book of the Torah should not depart from your mouth. You are to meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it, for then you will make your ways prosperous, and then you will be successful. And it was exactly the same emphasis on continually that described the man of God in Psalm 1, saying, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be like a tree planted by the river of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. Now, the Hebrew word translated there as prosper, the word salach, speaks of a venture that continues to succeed, in contrast to one that fails sooner or later. Meaning it can refer to the continuing witness of a godly person who faces loss or persecution just as much as it can to someone for whom things keep going so well that they accumulate wealth and live in comfort. Like in the testimony of Habakkuk, who famously said, though the fig tree does not blossom, and there is no yield on the vines, though the olive crop fail and the fields produce no food, the flock is cut off from the fold, and there is no cattle in the stalls, yet will I triumph in Adonai, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Adonai, my Lord, is my strength. He has made my feet like a deer's, and will make me walk on high places. But despite Paul's best efforts to warn about the importance of continually counting ourselves as dead to sin, only a generation or two later, Yeshua had to reprimand the 7 believing communities in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 because they'd let the weeds grow, saying that although amazing things could still happen for them if they dealt with their stuff and lived as the overcomers they'd got the potential to be, they'd face spiritual discipline if they didn't. Like for Smyrna, he'd remove its lampstand. For Pergamum, he'd come and make war against them. And for Sardis, he'd come like a thief at an unknown hour, and so on. And as we thought about previously in part 1, this was what actually happened when the church allowed the weeds to grow through its early centuries, choking the truth and eventually severing all its Jewish connections. And the resulting disconnection was not resolved by the 16th century reformers, but instead got compounded by them, leaving a massive discontinuity between them and the position of the first believers, for whom their conviction about God's continuing purposes through Israel was what enabled them to have such a massive impact. And tragically, this discontinuity has travelled on through history, resulting in what's now known as replacement theology that permeates today's church without it even realising, causing it to believe it's replaced Israel in God's purposes and that it's become the new Israel. And which goes a long way to explain why the church, at least in the Western world, is not prospering and bearing fruit as it should in the very significant times we're in. All this being a long, long way from the lifestyle of continuity that Yeshua called his followers to when he said, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Which Yeshua's hearers would have got the drift of, having grown up with the Shema being continually taught to them when they sat down, got up, came in, went out, as being for the whole of life. But which is much less easy to get if you were a Greek-thinking Gentile who believed there was a separation between what was physical and what was spiritual. And because Paul did not use chapter breaks, this is most likely why after finishing what we call Romans chapter 11, he immediately began Romans 12 like this. I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Paul's very strong encouragement comes as much to us who are third millennium Gentiles as it did to those believers in Rome who also did not have a Jewish heritage. For us to consider in the whole of our lives whether what we're about is actually good and acceptable and even perfect in God's sight. And a very practical way to get into this comes through these words. Through Yeshua, then, let us continually offer up to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips giving thanks to his name. So, with that, let's now think about these three questions. How can the Shema help us to continually count ourselves? How do we then reflect God's character? And why is doing it continually so important?